Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is April 14, 2024, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's an honor to welcome in discussion members of the Toronto, Calgary, and Chicago Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. This is session number 6 of our series on Plato's longest dialogue, The Laws. Today we'll be reading Book 3, which, in its conclusion, returns to the theme of musical harmony, where we ended the discussion of Book 2 in our last meeting. Book 3 explores the development of harmony in the soul and in communities by examining human history, opening with a discussion of humanity's emergence from planet-wide cataclysms like floods that reduced our numbers and conflicts to very few, and we had to rebuild societies from ground up. So as always, to contribute your thoughts to our discussion today, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom. And for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. So that everyone has a chance to speak, I'll call on you in the order that hands are raised, using first name only. Once we finish recording in 2 hours, I invite anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. 3 weeks ago, we ended with a reading from 668b to 670a, where the Athenian, Clinias from Crete, and Megillus from Sparta were discussing accurate judgment of the representations of eternal being that are perceived by our physical senses. Judgment, they said, children should learn in developing a sense of virtue. The beginning of Book 2 defined virtue as the general concord of reason and emotion. And in Book 3, the statement is made that disaccord between a person's rational judgment and feelings of pleasure and pain constitute, quote, the very lowest depth of ignorance, unquote. In the course of examining the history of rulers of the Persian Empire, as well as the League of Sparta with 2 other cities, Book 3 provides observations on human behavior motivated by pleasure and pain that persist today, 2,400 years later. Successful navigation of pleasure and pain's opposed emotions relies on self-control of our desires, which is a continuing theme from Books 1 and 2, and on our ability to measure, calculate, and balance differences among our perceptions. The point is that our capacity for measurement and judgment is best conducted when our pleasure and pain responses are attuned to the soul's understanding of the good. Some think that there is no absolute good, and in our discussion on Book 2, participants raise concerns that by insisting on an absolute good, Plato is an elitist and attempting to indoctrinate the young. This caused some to conduct a survey of modern history and contend that today's educational systems indoctrinate the young in cultural norms that might not be so good. So in understanding Plato's approach to the good in learning and knowledge, it's important to recall the perspective that he presents in all of his dialogues, and particularly in Book 10 of the Laws, where we began our series, that the cause of the universe itself is reason. Reason, he says, resides in the middle of the universe and in our souls, where reason mediates the often conflicting demands of need and desire. For Plato, reason provides order in the universe and is the first cause of the universe. With reason underpinning the universe, there is nothing that is random, and, as Socrates states in the Phaedo, everything comes to be from a cause. Our continuing human challenge in measuring the order of causes and effects in time is the imprecision of our physical senses. So as we now know from Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, it's impossible to judge the position of a physical object accurately in both space and time, and empirical evidence is therefore limited. Everything in the physical universe that we perceive with our 5 senses is continually undergoing change in what Plato calls the state of becoming. It's a state where nothing is, but everything is a representation of things that have eternal existence. The soul's faculty of reason, however, has access to the eternal realm of being, in which there is permanence of existence and absolute good. We don't have empirical access to eternal being, but only through reason, which moderates our emotions like pain and pleasure. In the universe constructed around reason itself, the imperfect measurements of our 5 senses can be oriented to goodness and correctness by our sense of reason. It's perhaps as Phil stated in our last meeting, that wisdom is connecting the intellect with being grounded in existence. For those who disagree with Plato and see neither reason for the existence of the universe nor an eternal state of being, man would naturally be the final measure of all things. This was the position of the sophist Protagoras in Plato's Theaetetus, and it came under debate in our discussion on Book 2. The point is especially relevant at the end of today's reading, where it's held that there is, in fact, a correct and incorrect way of using music, and that music and harmony in general are not purely a matter of individual appetite, but are born of beauty itself. So, how do we find the path to correctness and make order out of the disorder of space and time that can plague our senses? Book 3 invites us to go to the origin of this question by thinking about what happens when humanity is reduced to few numbers and little knowledge following natural disasters, and how we learn to transcend challenges that arise through time. So I'll start today's session with a reading on this from 677c to 680a, which I have here on the screen. And this is following a recollection of the repeated destruction of humanity, quote, by floods and plagues and many other causes, so that only a small fraction of it survived. So that was the opening of the dialogue, or the opening of the book. So the Athenian begins. Perhaps we can describe the state of mankind after the cataclysm like this. In spite of a vast and terrifying desolation, plenty of fertile land was available, and although animals in general had perished, it happened that some cattle still survived, together with perhaps a small stock of goats. There were few enough, but sufficient to maintain the correspondingly few herdsmen of this early period. Clinias responds, agreed. But at the moment we are talking about the state and the business of legislation and political organization. Is it conceivable that any trace at all of such things survived, even, so to speak, in the memory? Of course not, replies Clinias. Out of those conditions, all of the features of our present-day life developed. States, political systems, technical skills, laws, rampant vice, and frequent virtue. What do you mean, asks Clinias. My dear sir, the Athenian responds, can we really suppose that the men of that period, who had no experience of city life in all its splendor and squalor, ever became totally wicked or totally virtuous? A good point, Clinias says. We see what you mean. The Athenian goes on, so it was only as time went on and the numbers of the human race increased that civilization advanced and reached its present stage of development? Exactly, Clinias agrees. The process was probably not sudden but gradual and took a considerable time. Yes, that's perfectly plausible, says Clinias. The Athenian continues, I imagine men were all numbed with fear at the prospect of descending from the hills to the plains. Naturally enough, Clinias says. The Athenian responds, and what a pleasure it must have been to see each other, there being so few of them at that time. However, pretty well all vehicles they might have used to visit each other by land or sea had been destroyed, and the techniques used to construct them had been lost, so that I suppose they found getting together none too easy. They suffered from a scarcity of timber, because iron, copper, and mineral workings in general had been overlaid with sludge and had been lost to sight, so that it was virtually impossible to refine fresh supplies of metal. Even if there was the odd tool left somewhere in the mountains, it was quickly worn down to nothing by use. Replacements could not be made until the technique of mining sprung up again among men. True, says Clinias. And how many generations later did that happen on our calculation? Clinias says, a good many, obviously. Well then, during that period, or even longer, all techniques that depend on a supply of copper and iron and so on must have gone out of use? Of course, agrees Clinias. For several reasons, then, war and civil war alike came to an end. How so? Clinias asks. The Athenian says, well, in the first place, men's isolation prompted them to cherish and love one another. Second, their food supply was nothing they needed to quarrel about. Except perhaps for a few people in the very early stages, there was no shortage of flocks and herds, which is what men mostly lived on in that age. They always had a supply of milk and meat, and could always add to it plenty of good food to be got by hunting. They also had an abundance of clothes, bedding, houses, and equipment for cooking and other purposes. Molding pottery and weaving, skills that have no need of iron, were a gift from the god to men. His way, in fact, of supplying them with all that kind of equipment. His intention was that whenever the human race was reduced to such a desperate condition, it could still take root and develop. Well, because of all of this, they were not intolerably poor, nor driven to poverty to quarrel with each other, but presumably they did not grow rich either, in view of the prevailing lack of gold and silver. Now, the community in which neither wealth nor poverty exists will generally produce the finest characters, because tendencies to violence and crime and feelings of jealousy and envy simply do not arise. So these men were good, partly because of what we might call their naivete. When they heard things labeled good or bad, they were so artless as to think it a statement of the literal truth and believe it. This lack of sophistication precluded the cynicism you find today. They accepted as a truth the doctrine they heard about gods and men, and lived their lives in accordance with it. That is why they were the sort of people we have described. Clinias says, Megillus and I at least agree with your account. Well, if we compare them with the era before the flood and with the modern world, we shall have to say that the many generations which lived in that way were inevitably unskilled and ignorant of techniques in general, and particularly of the military devices used on land and sea nowadays. They must also have been innocent of the techniques of warfare peculiar to city life, generally called lawsuits and party strife, in which men concoct every possible device to damage and hurt each other by word and deed. Weren't our primitive men simpler and manlier, and at the same time more restrained and upright in every way? We have already explained why. You're quite right, says Clinias. The Athenian continues, let's remind ourselves that this reconstruction and the conclusions we shall draw from it are supposed to make us appreciate how early man came to feel the need of laws and who their lawgiver was. Well reminded, says Clinias. Perhaps they felt no need for legislators, and in that era law was not yet a common phenomenon. Men born at that stage of the world cycle did not yet have any written records, but lived in obedience to accepted usage and ancestral law, as we call it. So I wanted to open that as a bit of the background. And, this kind of continues, I guess, in Plato, this continuing discussion of these cycles of destruction. Certainly we saw in the Critias, Plato said that civilizations have been destroyed many times over. And in that destruction, memory gets lost. So memory isn't necessarily linear in the sense that it's interrupted. And so we have to start again. And so I think an interesting point being made here is that when things start up, there wasn't this scarcity that we maybe suffer now. And so there's so few people and abundant resources that they had no need of conflict. So they just kind of naturally got along with each other. And I think that's one of the points that they're raising here. And then we'll see this develop in terms of how society gets more complex and the need for more laws grows. I also just wanted to highlight in this that interesting part, which really made me think of today, about the devices we use in the modern world to damage and hurt each other by word and deed, lawsuits and party strife, which I think exists very much now, 2,400 years later. So that was the opening. So thoughts on that? George, welcome.
Hello, thank you very much. As I'm listening to this, what I'm thinking about is the idea of how humanity goes, and it's interesting that it is 2,400 years ago. Humanity goes from hunter-gatherer tribes to simple social forms to simple economies, relying on entirely, more or less, local resources. But as civilization evolves and we start to develop more and more complex systems of production, when we develop trade, and so hence the notion of society becoming more complex, more economically complex. Trade might even take place more at a distance. You have middlemen. How this requires now a set of rules and institutions to regulate all of this, right? And the idea that, when you think about hunter-gatherer tribes, if there was a major storm and, trees were knocked down, this and that really was not that big a catastrophe. But now, because human populations now are dependent on, again, these more sophisticated means of production, these more long-distance trade routes, the population grows larger and hence becomes more bifurcated from the land itself directly. So now we're more dependent on economic farming. In other words, producing for profit, the bifurcation between town and country. Now, when these systems get destroyed, right now you see crisis, hunger, you're dependent on water systems. And so he really is speaking, and I think very consciously, he is, they're observing the evolution of civilization becoming more complex, et cetera, and so forth. But they also see the liability in that, both in terms of how relations have to become more formalized, more institutionalized, but also in terms of natural disasters, et cetera, and so forth, they can lead to major human die-off. And so they're sensitive to all this, and they're thinking about really political economy. And so that, to me, this becomes very, very fascinating. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And those really good observations, particularly I think, as you said, the complexity develops, and there's more of us, and we become more interdependent. Instead of as being dependent on nature, as you were pointing out, we become dependent on each other. And in the laws, we're seeing a lot of discussion about pleasure and pain and our perception of pleasure and pain. And so, as each of us is seeking particular pleasures, well, my pleasure might not be your pleasure. And so, this sort of thing leads to conflict as we become more dependent on each other. And I think this is something that, as you said, as societies become more complex, there's more trading between societies, more rules are required to kind of constrain maybe some of the behavior of some people who may not be able to exercise reason as much as others. So, yeah, very interesting point. Did you want to continue on?
And this is probably true even 40 years up to about 40 years ago. We today we are presumably less sensitive to slander and libel because ultimately we have a written record, right? You can look me up. You don't have to rely on what I say or other people say. You can look at my criminal record, you can look at my financial record. But even up to 100 years ago, in maneuvering these complex economies, really what you had was your reputation, right? And if someone is bad mouthing you, undermining your reputation, they're undermining your ability to operate to thrive in this circumstance. So again, the notion of laws and rules and institutions, they're really almost more personalized, right? And so that's what I think about. In terms of what you're saying, that's really what I think about how things are personal in terms of personal reputation,
Yeah.
etc., and so forth. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, good point. And certainly the subject of shame has come up in Plato, and this is something that is also something that should constrain us, I think. So, so thanks for that. And we'll go to Darren.
Hello. So my thinking is extremely distracted right now because I'm trying to keep out the onslaught of Zoom bombers. They've been very
Okay.
persistent,
Thank
so
you. Thank you.
trying all kinds of different names to come in, but I think I've kept them at bay. Okay, so trying to focus on the text now. Yeah, this beginning section to me was a really fascinating read. I don't know if we've encountered it elsewhere in Plato. We've read a lot of Plato in this group already, but fascinating because it is like a preview of Rousseau. If anyone's familiar with Rousseau's Second Discourse, a very influential Enlightenment text about primitive man and how man is naturally good and has only become corrupted by civilization. But the story that's being told, the history that's being told is quite similar because it shows primitive man, these hill tribes, as being just basically naturally good. Although the story that goes on is also the same as Rousseau's in that they're good not because they have some principles or reason or lofty ideas or anything of that sort. It's because he keeps saying here because they're naive of their naivete. He calls them unsophisticated, and they're not fighting because they hardly see each other. Like they have plenty, like they're surrounded by all these resources because this is right after the one of the cycles of destruction, so like everything's at their disposal. So they're good out of a naivete, not because of any like maybe reason or that's not the sense we get. I think that's going to come up later, and when we see the beginning of the need for laws as population rises, becomes more dense. So I think this story is almost like Rousseau's, although I should say Rousseau's story is very much like Plato's because Rousseau almost, I feel like, I don't know if anyone's drawn this connection. I never hear people draw this connection, but Rousseau's story is pretty much almost exactly Plato's here. So there's a lot of echoes. And I think last week we saw that there's a lot of echoes in Kant of what Plato said about nothing is really unconditionally good except the good itself. Even virtues like moderation can be used for evil ends. So like that's so Kant echoes. So anyway, I'm just saying there's a lot of it seems like a lot of philosophers are stealing from Plato's laws, later influential philosophers. And just one more thing. Okay, so just a couple of really quick things. James, I think the line you were looking for at the end was that it says here, in particular, primitive man must have been quite innocent of the crafty devices that city dwellers use in the rat race to do each other down, and all the other dirty tricks that men play against one another must have been unknown. So yeah, I really like that line too. So again, it comes back to this idea that they're good, but sort of out of a naivete. Like they're not rat like, they're not scheming and manipulative. They just don't have it in them yet. Like,
Yeah.
um, and yeah, just maybe find a really quick point, and this maybe ties back a bit to what George was talking about. That the story being told here is also that this kind of political development is natural. And I say this because it harkens back to our meetups on book 10 of the laws about reason and how reason is natural, and what we come up with reason is totally natural. It's part of the universe. In fact, it's the most fundamental logic of the universe. And here, like, we have a story about this development, not as an artificial imposition, which would be a kind of very Hobbesian view, but it's kind of like Rousseau again. It's like there's a natural development that naturally takes us there. So politics and political philosophy, like, this is part of human nature and something we have to reckon with, and not something to just discard or or just diminish.
Yeah, thank you for those really interesting comparisons. I hadn't realized that Rousseau had talked about that, but whether Rousseau was stealing from Plato or whether it's just a natural thing to think about, following a destruction of a civilization, I guess it could have been either way. But it's interesting, as you said, that it's out of naivete that they behave naturally in some sort of harmony and concord, both with themselves and with nature. Maybe they hadn't discovered reason yet, or they hadn't exercised reason sufficiently, but they started with this naivete. And I guess maybe part of the story is to say that over time, maybe we exercise reason, and reason becomes stronger as we exercise it. So that's interesting. We'll see how that goes, particularly as we look at the second theme in terms of how we manage the soul's desires. So the desires increase as the number of people increase, and we see more opportunities. So yeah, really interesting point. Thank you. And then we have Mark and then Phil. So Mark.
Thanks, James. Great to hear everybody's comments on this. This idea of the naivete, and I'm looking at the translation on Perseus of Bury, and he uses simple-mindedness. I don't think either of these English translations really capture the Greek word of euatheia, which it breaks down into EU, which is good, and athe, which is something to do with character. That's going to be important going all the way through the laws, I think. So being well disposed, of a good character, might be something that's closer to the mark of what he's talking about. Naivete suggests that you think something, but you're actually wrong about it.
Interesting.
And simple-mindedness suggests something that's probably less good than on the bad side. But I think the Greek word, which has the word good in it, you, or well, is a different sort of balance. And you did ask, James, right at the end, whether there was, this was somehow pre-rational. If you go down to 679E, they were also more simple and brave. The word simple there comes in the euatheia as well. They were also brave and temperate, and in all ways most just. So if they do have all of these virtues, who knows, maybe they also have some sort of reason as well to go along with it. My last question was about how the rationale for looking at this whole ancient post-Diluvian kingdom, or post-Diluvian world, which he says it is kind of a politeia in a way. There is a leader, is from the beginning of the chapter, which you didn't read, I don't think, which asked the question, how do these politeia come about? And since I wasn't here when you read book 2, and I can't really remember it that clearly, I know that at the end of the discussion of the importance of drinking at the end of book 2, you wouldn't necessarily think that the very next question would be, how do politeia or cities come into being? So do we need to ask about the motivation for this whole thing? Or is it already clear from the scope of books 1 and 2?
That's a good question. And I think we'll see in this book that they do talk about how cities come into being and how that complexity develops. And yeah, so we'll explore that certainly. And but I really appreciate your pointing out the translation difference. Certainly, being of good character, and especially that word good, I think that you highlighted is quite different, I think, from naivete. There's a difference between simple and good. And I think you pointed out two instances of good where it makes me think that maybe the original people who emerged from these catastrophes hadn't developed bad yet. Maybe bad is something that's developed. Maybe we all start good, and bad is a developed thing as we fail to exercise reason, I guess maybe. And so I really like the way you pointed that out. Yeah, and then certainly let's follow the story about how communities develop. And I have a little summary about that before the next reading, so we'll follow that. So thank you for those points, and we'll go to Phil.
Yeah, I feel this section is maybe too speculative. It might be more psychological than actually the describing the history, or in this case, maybe prehistory. Because we know these days that many of the things that we thought happened anthropologically were at least somewhat different. And so therefore, they didn't really have a feedback in terms of what archaeological or anthropological evidence there are. And so that they're speculating on what might have happened. And it's reasonable to speculate on that based on kind of maybe human psychology. But I'm not sure if that's the way it is, because I don't know if they understood like the prehistory, the Paleolithic period, and how that developed, and how the pre-ancestors as a caveman actually behaved. We still don't know, but we know more than they used to. So I think maybe it's reasonable because you have to start your speculation at some level. But I wonder whether they actually even try to figure out what actually happened with the absence of records and try to dig out some evidence for what might have happened. So, yeah, I wonder about that. That's it, Phil.
That's a good question. And this isn't the first time that Plato has gone way back into ancient history, or what he thinks ancient history is. In other dialogues, he's talked about what the ancient Egyptian priests told Solon about time 10,000 years before Plato, which would be now 12,000 years before us. So whether they had some sort of source of knowledge of this that they can confirm with, or whether it's speculation, it's a good question. I think certainly, though, you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said at the beginning that it's at least a psychological portrait. And I think maybe that is key. So maybe it's not as important whether this is actually true history, but I think maybe, I guess the question is it an inaccurate representation of psychological history, of how civilizations develop, whether it's coming from a cataclysm, or whether it's just simply early people just arriving on the scene and there simply wasn't many of them, and they were surrounded by an abundance of resources. So certainly I would think that kind of psychological profile might prevail. So thank you
Yeah,
for
I think that's important to focus on that, because in a sense, the psychological means that it's an inner evidence rather than exterior evidence.
Mhm.
And there's somewhat of a belief that human beings, even early human beings, are quite similar to the way we would think given the conditions that it was. So
Mhm.
the inner versus the outer it's an important point. And that might be important too, because Plato is interested in the soul. So maybe that's where
Mhm.
it really is focus. That's
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, inner versus outer. I like that, and the focus on the soul for sure. Um, so we'll have Darren and then Mark, and then I'll go on to do the second reading after Mark.
Yeah, just quick response to what Phil was saying, whether this is actual history. A big chunk of this is clearly speculative, although Plato seems to think that these stories about the Great Flood and all that are like, a lot of people think this at the time, or at least the Athenian, I mean, in the dialogue. And the Athenian also says that these primitive men existed millions of years ago. I think it literally said millions. So we're talking huge stretches of time they're imagining here. But also, there is going to be actual history, though. As we come closer to the present day, like through book 3, we get more and more of actual history coming to the fore, like actual events, actual people. And so I think there is a way in which it actually is historical, in that, once we have more information, it is going to become much more concrete. So we have a comparison with of Sparta, with Athens, and also the Persians, for instance, and how these societies developed. I just want to make a general point about this history, though, which is that I think it's kind of cool that we see Plato dealing with history here, because it's often promised in other dialogues. For instance, we read what's the one on the metaphysics, the Timaeus, about putting the Republic into motion. There, Socrates was unhappy with the Republic because he says, I don't know if this will actually work, because we haven't actually put it into motion. We sort of just theorize in the ideal. And then in the Critias, the history keeps getting postponed until the dialogue just suddenly stops. But here, so it's great that we're actually finally getting the history that keeps getting deferred and postponed in other dialogues. And it's quite fascinating, and it seems to be quite influential, because Rousseau carries this idea forward. I think it's quite clear. And just a final thing about this history aspect. So at the beginning of book 3, he talks about like why they're doing this, or how we're going to discover the origins of politics and political society. And I thought it was interesting that a comment the Athenian makes is that one way to do this is to look at a state's moral progress or decline. So this development and these cycles aren't purely about like sort of natural, in the sense of natural physical environmental circumstances. It has to do with morality. I think that's an interesting sort of angle on it. And insofar as history is tied in with a kind of either moral progress or decline, it would be psychological, the way Phil perhaps brought up, in that history is also a development of this reason. And insofar as reason is part of our psychology, then it is also psychological development. So this, like, he is tying all of this together, like history and morality and reason. When you put it together, it could be a kind of psychological description too.
Yeah, interesting. Very good points. Putting the ideal city into motion in the Timaeus was kind of a way of imposing time on an ideal template. If the city was the template at the beginning of the Timaeus, the city from the Republic, at the beginning of the Timaeus, Socrates says he couldn't imagine it being in motion. In other words, being in time. And yeah, and certainly the Critias, when they go back in history and talk about the Atlanteans, which remains a legend that continues today to fascinate people. There was a psychological point in that when they said that the Atlanteans failed because they became materialistic and they lost their godlike ways. So again, there's a moral point there, but whether that actually existed or not is another question. But certainly we'll see a lot of history in this, and we'll get into that. So thank you. And we'll go to Mark.
I just am fascinated by, Phil, your modernity, if I could put it that way, to be skeptical of the account that Plato's given here. And I think there's a parallel for this in the text, kind of right where you were, James, around 679c. My translation says that none of them had the shrewdness of the modern man to suspect a falsehood. And how is that being translated in your...
So that's 679c?
Yes.
Now, the community in which neither wealth nor poverty exists will generally produce the finest characters, because tendencies to violence and crime and feelings of jealousy and envy simply do not arise. I wonder if that's the passage.
No, it's right before 679d.
This lack of sophistication precluded the cynicism you find today. They accepted as the truth the doctrine they heard about
There you go.
gods and
The
men and lived their
cynicism.
lives. Yeah.
the cynicism that we see today, and I'm not criticizing Phil for your skepticism. I'm trying to show how it's reflected in the text. And the Greek there is like, no one would sort of suspect a falsehood, as people do today, he says, as now. But I think it is important to ask, is this something that he imagines as being historically true, or is it something that allows him methodologically to get at the question of the origin of government? Because he's trying to imagine a time before government. And so I think he is trying to get Clinius to agree, yeah, this happened. Because we've seen it happen in our lifetime, and we don't know how far back lifetimes go. So it's not a question of did this happen. I think they are convinced that there is a lot of merit to this kind of long anthropological vista of time. And I think the Greek for the billions of years was just like, for a time that was apeiron. And you might know that word from some of the dialogues. An unlimited time that this took place. So, and the question I thought you raised was a good one that we haven't really been able to answer yet, is what is the role of reason here? I tried to mention earlier that they were attributing bravery, temperance, and justice to these people. And I noticed also at 679c, just near the beginning of 679c, he says, so these men were good, both for these reasons and because of their simple-mindedness, that is the euethe. So he's coupling goodness, that is agathon, with the euethe. He's saying, look, they're both, because they are the product of this community that was neither rich nor poor. And that develops the best ethe there are, the best characters. So I think that we should be thinking about, or maybe it's a good question, about the role of reason, which he hasn't mentioned, but he's mentioned all the other virtues as well as their goodness here.
Yeah, very good point. I think that reason, and we'll see reason in the next section, but yeah, definitely, I do think Plato does think that many civilizations have been destroyed before and all memory has been lost. I do think that that's something that's consistent in Plato. So I think he believed that. But yeah, it's interesting to think about how sort of these people arrive on the scene and they're inherently good, and that badness maybe is something that develops over time when reason isn't exercised. So yeah, we'll see reason in the next section.
James, one more thing on that inherently good. I think one more piece of evidence for it is in 678E. No, 678C, middle of C, where the Athenian has a longer speech there. And he says, because they were so few of them around about in those days, were they not delighted to see one another?
Yeah.
It's like they were just defaulting to delight.
Yeah.
And I think that's another mark of their sort of inherent sweetness.
Sweet, yeah, I like that. Yeah, I like that line. Their delight in seeing each other. Otherwise, it would have been a lonely place, right? So few people. So maybe we forget that loneliness in our struggle and competition now, that we should be grateful that other people are around. Yeah, I'll go to George, and then we'll do the second reading. George.
I mean, it's very fascinating to me. It really has opened my mind actually to listening to this conversation, because the following: this notion of reason as objectively valid, as something metaphysically true. Well, think about this. Okay, and this is, in my estimation, fundamentally underappreciated. And part of it is, and I hate analytic philosophy, I believe it is a source of ignorance. Because what Plato is pointing to is the reality that you have these, in their context, these very substantial economic units, right? Think about the trade that's taking place. And the fact that people travel for days and then come back, and all these transactions are taking place, right? Think about the miracle of the meeting of the minds, right? How you can successfully predict what someone is thinking across hundreds of miles. In other words, you're conducting these transactions across hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles. And it's not you can pick up a phone. And so you're seeing this taking place, and you're seeing this system that is operating at the world level for you. And what you're seeing is the functioning of reason. And so there's this meeting of the mind, and this is what Plato's seeing. This is what the ancients are seeing, and they're understanding. They're saying this is really quite a miraculous process, and we have to philosophize about this. This raises fundamental metaphysical questions. Now, in terms of appealing to pre-modern man, they're good. See, it points to the inherent goodness of people. The idea that you can trust, that you can give someone a bag of gold and say, okay, go thousands of miles and bring me back X, Y, and Z, right? That speaks to the inherent trustworthiness of people. That's why I said before, again, the idea that if your reputation is sullied, right, your ability to maneuver in this system is destroyed. So hence, again, the development of laws and institutions, right? But the development of laws and institutions are only necessary for the bad actors, right? Because for everyone else, which is operating according to reason, right, there's no need for that. And so early on, again, there's no need for that because people are inherently good, right? You could trust people. Again, the networks are much smaller and people can gain information for themselves. And again, it just, there is an important metaphysical argument being made here about the nature of humanity and how, really, to use modern parlance, how we are wired in together. And so, again, this is really where philosophy is born, in this realization of this ability to coordinate across long distances and long periods of time successfully. This necessitates philosophy. This is the beginning of philosophy. This is why early on you could just trust on the goodness of people. You don't have to philosophize about things. Okay, people are good. You give them money, they're going to go to their farm and come right back. Right? There's no need for philosophy in that question. We just assume, okay, people are good. They're not going to want to run off. You can find them. But now we need philosophy and metaphysics to understand this world system. So it's very much a function of political economy. And again, quote unquote, civilization. Again, very fascinating, very, very fascinating to learn that Plato was thinking along these lines. And this is what really, in my opinion, I'm going to say, sparks his notion of the world of ideas, something objective out there upon which the mind is drawing knowledge from collectively. And we're being shaped by this knowledge that is forever. Hence this notion of, I submit that this is probably the real importance of his notion of former civilization, right? Because what he's saying in essence is, even though all those institutions were destroyed, we can still intuitively understand them. Why? Because we're all operating relative to the truth of reason, right? So we can assume that even if a civilization, all its institutions are completely destroyed, new institutions are going to come up which basically operate in the same principles in a macro sense, right? This is what he's saying. So there is some truth to history and learning from the past. But the fact of the matter is that what drives institutional development is the world of ideas, sans history. Thank you very much.
Well, that was great, George. Thank you. It's I love it when you talked about the meeting of the mind, and it makes me think of both the Timaeus and the Philebus, in which the point was made that the universe itself has a soul. And so if we souls are part of the universal soul or sharing in the universal soul, then we would have this common sense of each other. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And also the idea that laws are for bad actors. And it's really encouraging to think that we could be born into this universe being naturally good, and we could stay naturally good, as you said, starting with philosophy. And I think also kind of what you were saying at the end there kind of reminded me of the premise that all knowledge is recollection, and that's throughout Plato, in the Meno certainly, and throughout a number of his dialogues, that all knowledge is recollection. And so we are recalling time. We're not inventing knowledge. We're just recovering knowledge from our common sense of time. So I think that was a really important point. So thank you for that.
If I could could you just put maybe some of that in the chat, some of the reading references,
Yeah.
if you could,
Yeah.
please? I really would appreciate that.
All right, will do. Yes, thank you.
You know what I wanted to say very quickly, if I could just follow very quickly, which is that it really speaks to Hegel. I'm going to say this, and this notion of a one world mind, right? There's one mind in which we are all accessing. And this is why we can have language. We're speaking through this, right? We're referring to, again, it's very Platonic, right? We're speaking to these ideas that are in this ether through which we are operating through. And so, again, this is why we can have a meeting of the minds. This is why we can look at tree and say tree. This is why children can learn language in such a prodigious rate, right? There is a shared mind. And maybe it's metaphorical, maybe it's real, but there's a shared mind. And again, I think Plato is pointing to this. Explain the rise and the existence of civilization. This is the only way that we really can explain civilization, if you will. Thank you very much. And again, those references in the chat will be so deeply appreciated if you have some time for that. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, thank you. And and again, for Plato, the soul never dies. So it's something that just keeps repeating over time with different experiences. So I know there's a few people with hands up, and I wanted to ask maybe Faiwu, if you haven't spoken before, so I'd invite you maybe just to speak, and then we'll move to the second reading, if that's all right.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
I haven't read anything about a few chapters of the Republic by Plato. However, I was listening to your conversation about human nature being good, naturally good before. I wonder whether that was true. I don't know whether that was described in Plato. But I would beg to differ. If human nature was naturally good, how could the civilizations, as you said, how could that several civilizations had been destroyed and we are left without memories of it? And I don't think human nature is naturally good. I think human nature is naturally self-centered, self-interest. However, the higher awareness we have, the more understanding we have, the more knowledge we have, we understand that being good to other people is the best way to promote our self-interest. So it's not because people were naturally good to begin with. Perhaps they just had more knowledge of whether being good or bad would entail, what being either good or bad would entail. That was just my understanding. Thank you.
Yeah, and you raised really good points there that I think we should really think about this idea of whether people are inherently good or whether there's some original corruption in our souls that we need to overcome. And that certainly, I think, looking around the world today, maybe that is maybe a natural conclusion about the way people are. And it's something that we need to explore, I think, and maybe that will come out of, as we read more of this, the natural nature of people. Yeah, really, really interesting question. And the idea, as you said, that being good to other people is not necessarily a selfless thing. It's something that could help us, and so it's advancing our own interests. And so is the question whether the motivation to be good to other people is a natural motivation or whether it's a self-preservation mechanism. I really like those questions, so thank you very much for those. So I know there's some hands up, so I'll just I'll go do this reading, and then we'll return to those who have points. So just leave your hands up, and we can return to your points or blend them into the discussion on the next reading. So the next reading goes from 687b to 689e. And between what I read at the beginning and this section, there was an account of how autocratic authority originated in households. So originally there was few people and there was individual households, and there was sort of an autocratic authority in the house. And then as groups of families started to get together, there was this aristocratic authority that emerged among these groups of families. So the aristocrats kind of started controlling these groups. And then they go on to talk about a history where then constitutional authorities of various types arose in different communities and cities. And then finally, there was leagues among the communities. And we'll see an example of the discussion about the league between Sparta, Argos, and sorry, I've forgotten the name of the third city. But there was a league that Sparta was part of. And so this kind of whole development of history is between what I read at the beginning and this section here. So let me just start this section here with the Athenian. Again, anyone who notices a case of great wealth or exceptional family distinction or something like that takes precisely the same line. He assumes that just because a man enjoys these advantages, his every wish will be granted, or at any rate, most of them, and the most important ones. Megillus answers, quite likely. Now then, the Athenian says, this shows that there is one specific desire common to all mankind. Isn't this the upshot of our discussion? What desire? Asks Megillus. That events should obey whatever orders one feels like giving. Invariably, if possible, but failing that, at least where human affairs are concerned. Very true, answers Megillus. The Athenian says, so seeing that this is the constant wish of us all, right from childhood to old age, isn't it inevitably what we are always praying for too? Of course, answers Megillus. And I suppose our prayers on behalf of those whom we love will be for precisely what they themselves pray for on their own behalf? Certainly is the answer. The Athenian says, a man who is a father loves the child who is his son? Of course, agrees Megillus. The Athenian says, yet there is a good deal in the son's prayers that the father will beg the gods never to grant. Megillus says, you mean when the son who prays is still young and irresponsible? Yes, I'm thinking too of when the father is senile or even unduly impulsive because of second childhood and has lost all sense of what is right and proper. He gets into the same state as Theseus when he dealt with Hippolytus, who died so wretchedly, and his prayers became very vehement indeed. But if the son understands the situation, do you think he will join in his father's prayers given those circumstances? Megillus answers, I know what you mean. Your point, I take it, is that you should demand your own way in your prayers only if your wishes are supported by your rational judgment or reason. And this rational outlook should be the object of the prayers and efforts of us all, states and individuals alike. The Athenian says, it should indeed, and in particular, let me remind myself, it should always be the aim of a state's legislator when he frames the provisions of his laws. And I remind you again to recollect the beginning of our discussion of what you two recommended. You said that the good legislator should construct his entire legal code with a view to war. For my part, I maintained that this was to order him to establish his laws with an eye on only one virtue out of the four. I said he ought to keep virtue as a whole in mind, but especially and preeminently the virtue that heads the list, judgment and wisdom, and strength of mind such that desires and appetites are kept under control. Our discussion has come full circle, and being the speaker at the moment, I make the same point as before. You can treat it as a joke if you like, but if you prefer, you can take it seriously. I maintain that if you lack wisdom, praying is a risky business, because you get the opposite of what you want. If you like to suppose that I am in earnest, do so. I'm confident that if you follow the line of argument we opened up a moment ago, you'll soon discover that the cause of the ruin of the kings and the whole enterprise was not cowardice, nor a lack of military expertise in the commanders or in those whose role it was to obey them. The disaster was caused by every other sort of vice, and in particular ignorance about man's most vital concerns. And if that was true then, it is even more so today. And precisely the same thing will be true in the future. If you like, I'll try to press on with the next stages of in the argument and develop the point. As you're my friends, I'll do my very best to make it clear. Clinius interjects, to make a speech in your praise, sir, would be a tasteless thing to do. Our actions, rather than our words, will show our regard for you. We shall give you our closest attention. This is the best way to tell whether a gentleman approves or not. Megillus interjects, well said, Clinius. Let's do as you say. Clinias responds, and so we shall, God willing. Now let's have your explanation. So the Athenian picks up. Well then, to go back onto the track of the argument, we maintain that crass ignorance destroyed that great empire. And here he's talking about Argos, Messene, and Sparta. Messene was the third city I couldn't remember before. So Argos, Messene, and Sparta were in a league and formed this great empire. And he continues, and that it has a natural tendency to produce precisely the same results today. If this is so, it means that the legislator must try to inspire states with as much good sense as possible and eradicate folly as far as he can. Obviously, says Clinias. And so what kind of ignorance would deserve the title crass? See if you agree with my description. I suggest this kind. What? Asks Clinias. The Athenian answers, the kind involves when a man thinks something is fine and good, but loathes it instead of liking it, and conversely when he likes and welcomes what he believes is wicked and unjust. I maintain that this disaccord between his feelings of pleasure and pain and his rational judgment constitutes the very lowest depth of ignorance. It is the most crass in that it affects the most extensive element in the soul, the element that experiences pleasure and pain, which corresponds to the most extensive part of the state, the common people. So when the soul quarrels with knowledge or opinion or reason, its natural ruling principles, you have there what I call folly. This applies both to the state in which people disobey their rulers and laws, and to the individual when the fine principles in which he really believes prove not only ineffective, but actually harmful. It's all these examples of ignorance that I should put down as the worst kind of discord in a state and individual, not the mere professional ignorance of a workman. I hope you see what I mean, gentlemen. Clinias says, we do, my friend, and we agree with what you say. The Athenian answers, so let's adopt this as an agreed statement of policy. No citizens who suffer from this kind of ignorance should be entrusted with any degree of power. They must be reproved for their ignorance, even if their ability to reason is outstanding and they have worked hard at every nice accomplishment that makes a man quick-witted. It is those whose characters are at the other extreme who must be called wise, even if, as the saying is, they cannot read, they cannot swim. And it is these sensible people who must be given the offices of state. You see, my friends, without concord, how could you ever get even a glimmer of sound judgment? It's out of the question. But we should be entirely justified in styling the greatest and most splendid concord of all the greatest wisdom. Anyone who lives a rational life shares in this wisdom, but the man who lacks it will invariably turn out to be a spendthrift and no savior to the city. Quite the reverse, because he suffers from this particular kind of ignorance. So as we said just now, let's adopt this as a statement of our views. So that was a rather long section, but I think it was really something that touches on reason, which we opened up the discussion with in that recounting of very early history. And, you know, I guess I wanted to get some opinions on this, and we have, I think, people who wanted maybe to comment on the previous section as well. So I'll take a combination of points, I guess. I'm wondering particularly what people think of the idea that we have this one common desire that things should unfold as we wish, and we pray for it. Now, I think the message that they're saying here is be careful what you pray for unless reason is exercised in the process. So I'll go to, we have first Darren. So Darren.
Yeah, so I did have a response to some of the discussion earlier regarding, in particular, George's comment about the meeting of the minds. And I think this, again, harkens back to what I mentioned about the beginning of Book 3, where Plato describes trying to tell the story of man, the history of man, as a moral process. And so not only does this remind me of Rousseau, but also Kant in his political theory, in his writings on cosmopolitanism, also like explicitly develops a theory of why we need to understand the history of mankind, not just as a natural process in the sense of like physical natural process, but also in terms of our moral development. Kant is very explicit about this. Like he develops this theory in his political writings. And regarding for the need for this meeting of the minds, and I think this brings us back to the issue of the way in which primitive man was good. So this is something that Mark was interested in. So I think we sort of skipped the reading of his section, but I just want to bring up some, I think, salient points. So the reason we need to start developing these laws is because originally, although man was like good or sweet and good-hearted, they were living like in sort of these scattered, disparate communities and as population grows and they start forming societies together, they had to agree on ways to live together. The reason for that is because Book 3 describes them as having one, different laws, so they need to figure out what they're going to agree on. Two, they have different religions. They have different religious standards. They don't agree on what the gods are like. So although they might have been naive and good and worshiping, whatever gods they were in their naivete in their own communities, but now that they're together, they're going to have different. They have to figure this out. So this was explicitly pointed to. There was another section. I don't know if this comes up later. I was trying to find it, but it describes how in each of these communities there are many different titles to authority. So there's the authority of parents over children, master over slave, older over younger, higher status over younger status.
That's coming up in the next reading.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, the point of that, the relevant point from that section for what I'm discussing now is that he says explicitly that these different kinds of authority in these communities are a source of civil strife. Like that's literally, at least that's how the translation goes. And how all these kinds of authority that exist, they conflict with one another. He explicitly says that. So although as society becomes more complex, as population grows, as we start meeting different peoples and, neighboring peoples with different religions and different laws, we are going to have to start using our reason. We can't be that happy, naive person anymore. And I think this does not deny, so this is also Rousseau's story, right? So Rousseau in the second discourse does not deny that just because they were naive in these ways, and naive in the sense they haven't encountered all these like realities of social development, economic development that just sort of come along. Like Rousseau also does not deny that this primitive man is really good. Like they do have these virtues, but they have these virtues because they haven't encountered the possibility of riches and all these things, which are also in a way innate in the sense that people do tend to be drawn to these things, but they just haven't encountered them. They haven't encountered people with different religions, and maybe that is threatening to their own sense of reality because their religion is different. And so in Rousseau's story, although they are good, there's sort of a fall when man sort of starts developing what Rousseau like describes as a kind of self-consciousness about themselves because of their difference with other people, and they start comparing themselves to other people, and so they start developing sort of self-consciousness. And once that happens, you can't go back. We have to find a way forward. You can't go back to that naive sort of primitive goodness. Once the self-consciousness develops for Rousseau, you have to find a way forward that involves reason to sort of recover that goodness, but at a higher level. So that was a story Rousseau told. But this is the story that's being told by Plato, like 2,000 years before Rousseau. So I think that's worth like just pointing out. And again, it's not to deny that primitive man was not actually good, but good in the naive, and that they haven't encountered a lot of realities and possibilities yet. And once these are on the table, we need to find a higher order.
Yeah, I mean, especially in this section that I just read, if this is true that there is one specific desire common to all mankind, and it's that events should obey whatever orders one feels like giving, then I guess the more people there are, the more orders there are, and the more conflicts among those orders. So yeah, I think that's an interesting, Yeah,
just quickly, I wanted to add to that, like that section about this common desire of mankind, which is that things just obey whatever we want. So like that's a common desire that the Athenian states, and actually there is a way in which that's possible if you're primitive man. Because he was described as having like all the resources were abundant, all the everything was, but like once population gets more dense, once things become more scarce, you can't be that person anymore. So although we still have this desire for things to obey whatever we wish, that's not going to happen anymore. So we need, as he says in that section you read, we need rationality, we need rational judgment, and that will bring a new unity.
Yeah, for sure. And especially now that there's 7.8 billion of us on this planet, there's 7.8 billion different sets of desires, and those who don't exercise reason have a very profound effect on the rest of us who think that we exercise reason, at least, or we try to through events like this. So thank you. Yeah, we'll go to George, then Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have a fundamentally different take on this, which is that, first and foremost, Plato just doesn't assert that people are good, just apropos of nothing. Disagree with this idea of, man is good, but he's corrupted by civilization. I think he would disagree with that altogether. First and foremost, man is inherently good, and he points to primitive man because if man were bad, then you could never build a civilization, right? Because if everyone was just in it for themselves, everyone would just be grabbing what they could and then defecting, right? And this is a very key important point of defecting. So man is laterally collaborative. man is a social political animal. Man is a function of the community, even in these early periods, right? And so it is because man is social, because man is political, it is because man is good that you can, again, develop sophisticated societies. Now, what happens is, and I think this is really the key point here that Plato is making, and this is a very, very important point, even for purposes of today, that what happens is in early societies, if let's say someone was bad in that society, well, you could just exile them, right? And that's what would happen. You just exile someone that was bad, someone that was working against the community, that was taking more in a non-legitimate way. And so, there was very simple social structure. So even the possibility for someone to be bad was very limited because, again, everything is very transparent. Now, and this is where the wise leader comes in. This is very important because what happens is as civilization evolved based on this goodness, and you develop institutions, and the economy becomes more complex, and you get a bifurcation between town and country. Indeed, you get town. Now you have a circumstance of dependency, right? So if there's someone that does bad, you can't really defect, right? So if you're doing trade and someone cheats you, I mean, again, you've been hurt economically, maybe bankrupted. You can't just defect. You just can't go off to, okay, our group is just going to go off and start a new tribe around that oasis. You can no longer defect, right? If someone's doing that, or exile becomes a much more problematic question. Now it becomes a question of the laws. So if someone's doing bad, now you need redress. You can't just defect to another, okay, my family, we're not happy with what you're doing, so let's just break off and you can't no longer do that. And then it becomes especially problematic if the leader is bad. And this is where the notion of now you need to theorize about the leader. So here it's very interesting because, and I'm very happy I came here because today I'm very, very ecstatic actually, because I've always understood Plato as a metaphysician. Now I'm seeing him more as a political economist. And again, as a person that is very keenly aware of the political implications of complex societies, complex economies. And so what happens is ultimately, what I'm going to say is this, is that people become dependent on the stability of the system. And this is where the potentiality for oppression comes in, right? Because if I control this institution, you can't simply defect. You're dependent on these institutions. And so, people can be oppressive in that circumstance because you have nowhere to go, right? If the king, basically rules against me unfairly, it's not like I can say, okay, you know what? I don't care. I'm going to go start my own family over here in a new oasis. You just have to take it. Because again, there's no way out. You're sort of trapped into these systems. And this is where oppression comes in. This is where people can express their darker natures and not be punished for it, right? Because again, in the old system, you lose half the tribe or they would exile you. So this is where, again, laws become a necessity and the wisdom of the leader and the wisdom of leaders. But it's also important to note that this is where oppression now starts to see its ugly face. This is where people can start to delve in, to lean into their darker impulses, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's still the case that man is good, but now man has the opportunity to act on his darker natures. And again, I come back, this is where we need laws to prevent people from leaning into those darker natures. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I mean, I think you've outlined the need for the laws. I think, here Plato is saying that we don't need just laws, we need harmony, we need virtue in the community. And so the constitution that they're going to be setting up for Magnesia is going to be one that inculcates virtue in the citizens. And this is not something I think, and we've spoke in our previous sessions, that this is not something that we see in our modern societies for the most part. So this is in addition to the laws. There needs to be this fundamental basis in virtue. And virtue needs to be based on reason, I think is what he's saying here. You made a really interesting comment at the beginning. If man were bad from the outset, then we're kind of doomed from the outset. And I thought that was really interesting. So if the universe is based on reason itself, and reason is in the very center of the universe, for what reason would the universe create beings like us who are fundamentally bad? I don't see a reason that the universe would do that. And I don't see further a reason why the universe would share with us the faculty of reason, right? Because in Plato's three-part soul, you have in one extreme need and then the other extreme desire, and reason sits in the middle, not just of the universe, but in the middle of the soul, moderating need and desire. And so this is really, I think, pretty fundamental. And so maybe this is partially an answer to the question that Faiwu asked earlier about the original nature of man. So thank you.
Can I just follow up on that?
Yeah.
Which I think in the final instance, the fact that man is a social animal, the fact that we need each other, and not in an economic way, but we need each other in a psychological and emotional way, automatically is going to dictate that we are good, right? Again, early man was good precisely because it could live together. And again, we had the possibility then simply to defect. So in other words, we can look at other animals, solitary animals, right? They don't work together and they're just happy on their own, which really is very alien to humans. When we think about the tiger or the cheetah, and they spend all their time by themselves. That's alien to the human, existentially speaking, human. We seek each other out. We have the experience of loneliness and depression. And so we seek each other out. And by definition, then, we have to be good, right? Because what happens when people are bad, right? They end up being alone. What I wanted to say was very quickly is that what we can say, and Plato's very helpful for the world today, because what we could say definitively is that we live in a dystopia. We live in a society that is inherently dysfunctional because the leaders are selfish. They're not wise. They are destroying the ecology. They are fundamentally greedy and self-centered. The notion of wealth addiction. And so it's not that man is bad, is that, again, Plato really is almost talking for our times, right? Can we really say that our leaders are wise? Can we really say that our leaders are drawing on laws? Or are they selfish, greedy, and maybe even gullible, in fact of the matter, right? The idea that they believe they could persist beyond ecological crisis, or they believe they could thrive in the context of global war. So the problem that we have is our leaders. And again, Plato points to this very explicitly some 2,000 plus years ago. He's giving us that lesson. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and we'd certainly see that lesson, as I pointed that one section about party strife and lawsuits. I mean, this is the world we live in now, 2,400 years later. You talked about animals. Animals do go in packs as well, right? So animals do have groups and they have leaders. The point you made about leaders, I mean, leaders, other than tyrants where people have no choice, leaders are the product of us. I mean, if we allow them to lead, then, I mean, the system obviously is not geared towards everybody having a say, but I think this is what he's saying here fundamentally, is that we all have reason. And if we all exercise reason, we won't get into these problems. The problem is when reason is not exercised, and these people are allowed to elevate themselves to this leadership position. So yeah, you make a very good point there, I think.
Can I say something? I think you're wrong on Plato. I think you're wrong because this is what it is. Plato's not saying, he's not a function of us. He's not saying that at all. Again, he is saying that we are dependent on leaders. Leaders have a leverage political economic system. Again, we cannot defect, right? So this is why it's important that we have wise leaders. This is why we need laws. Because if leaders were a function of us, right? If we were unhappy with the leaders, then we could easily replace them, right? But Plato's not saying that. Plato's saying we can't have tyrants. We can't have bad leaders. Why? Because we just can't defect. We just cannot say, okay, now we're just going to run off to our oasis. So we become dependent on institutions and systems that then open up the possibility for tyrants, for people to abuse the system, right? So again, Plato's rejecting this idea that leaders are a function of us. We need laws to judge their behavior, and we need to choose wise leaders. Otherwise, they can act unwisely, unjustly, and screw us over individually and screw society over broadly. That's what I would say to you.
Yeah, and we'll see how that develops. I mean, in book one, there was talk about the need to cultivate leaders from a very early age, right? And so Leaders just don't come out of nowhere. The question is, we need to cultivate them. So people need to develop a sense of virtue. The Constitution needs to be based on a sense of virtue, they're saying, so that people both know how to lead if they are called upon to lead, or to be led. And this is, I think, the problem in our societies now, is that we are not cultivating either leaders or people who can be led. And so this gives rise to this tension. I do want to go on to Phil and to Faiwu, and then I think we'll read the next part, because that talks about balance and harmonizing. And I think that's an important thing in the context of leadership that George was talking about. So Phil and Faiwu.
Yeah, I like the part that George says about sort of like dependency. It seems to me the reason why we develop, well, let's say society or relationships at all, is that human beings are, for two reasons, that we need each other. One is that we are bisexual. In other words, we need the other to even have civilization to survive. That's number one. Number two is that we are very vulnerable beasts when put in nature. I mean, like, we wouldn't survive. So being with others to a certain degree helps our ability to at least survive through the year, let alone for a long time. The question then becomes a question of, let's say, how does these dependencies develop when the society gets very complex? Because I was first going to say that, in a sense, human beings are a blending of good and evil. And this good and evil means it has something to do with the dependency that you need others to survive. But the question is, when you get into a very complex society, you do end up having to have some kind of laws and rules to govern the situation. Because when society gets very big, it's very important to displace certain people that are not getting not enough support, so they become alienated and diverge from the system, because the distribution. Now, that the distribution doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is going to get exactly the same thing. It's just that there has to be a degree of equity in the distribution, so that you have a sense of security, which is what society provides. But when you got lack of it, then in a sense, you begin to see the negative values in it. And George mentioned at one point about the market and how the sustained value could exist through long distance in long time. That's actually development of the ledger book, in a sense. You owe me, 3 crates of apple or whatever. When you have a situation where there's a barter system and things are happening right at the time, you gave a guy a crate of apples, he give you a crate of oranges, it's settled right there, no problem, no ledger needed. But when it becomes much more complex in terms of distance and trade, then you do need a ledger system. But once you have a ledger system, it becomes very apparent that, in a sense, there could be a difference in the balance book. You could take advantage of that. So it creates its own sort of like diversions, a schism that happens. So for those people, first, I suppose, who are criminals, see that, they're going to take advantage of that ledger book and create an imbalance and take advantage of negative numbers. But then if it spreads out throughout society, then in a sense, everybody is doing it. And the problem when you have a large city and a large population, and particularly now you have large countries, I guess the third thing that holds it together in a way is human relationship is a relationship of intimacy. You know the guy, you know these people, you're familiar with them you could trust them. But when you get to a point where there's like thousands of people, I think that might even been the case in the Greek city. And then certainly when you get to millions of people, you don't know any of those people.
Yep.
Why shouldn't you take advantage of them? I mean, like
Yep.
when you have all sorts of means, do so. And when it becomes such that even the leaders that we now know are taking advantage of, you know, insider trading and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it just, so the number has something to do with it. I think Plato at some point talked about the size of the cities, you know, when it gets too large, it just hard to manage. So I think that's where you really need very, very strict institution to manage the law to make sure that people behave, which by the way, means that you don't have to necessarily exile the people. You just have to teach the people the concept of displacement. Like, hey, just defer what you're gonna do. Defer the fact that you're gonna be a criminal and steal from other people. Just put it off. Just keep putting it off, you know, and you'll survive and that's be fine, you know. So you have to develop a sense of, you know, deference, you know, give way to somebody else. You know, you do that all the time, even people who are in the right of way. Let's say you're driving, somebody's being a very aggressive, you know, like no problem. I'm just gonna wait a little bit and defer. I mean, if you get to the point where you're gonna just exert your rights right at the moment, then it's gonna get into a brawl. You know, that's not very good. So I think you have to teach people how to defer their wishes to a certain degree too, in order to create a peaceful society. Just because there are people who behave badly. So
Yeah.
that's it, Phil.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Deferral of gratification, I guess. And that goes back to the discussion that we had about pleasure and pain, right? So sometimes one has to defer what one really wishes for. And sometimes we discover in the process of deferring that what we wished for, we actually don't want anymore. So it's an interesting thing. I really like the way you talked about the ledgers, of course, my being an accountant really struck me, and the differences and the balances, especially when you don't know people. It's one thing to look in a person's eyes and to understand what they're thinking from that, but when you're dealing with somebody that you can't see or multiple parties, it just becomes literally a numbers game, and then that becomes very difficult to strike a proper balance. And balance is something that I want to talk about in the next reading, which I'll do after Fai Wu. And I know there's a couple folks with hands up. But I'll just ask you after Fai Wu just to hold your thoughts, and I'll read the next part, which isn't too long, and then we can get back to the discussion if that's all right. So Fai Wu.
I want to address what George said. Like, I think he made 2 points. He thinks leaders are corrupt. I think that's because you don't know about yourself enough. Leaders reflect our collective unconscious, especially in Western nations. They're explicitly chosen by us. But even in authoritarian societies, the leaders also reflects the collective unconscious of the society. It's because the whole society or the majority of the people in that society are authoritarian. That's why they end up with authoritarian leaders. The second point is not everyone needs leaders. Some people can self-govern and manage their lives and business and everything through voluntary associations with other people. And those who need leaders are not qualified to choose leaders because they don't even know themselves. They can't even govern themselves. So they will only choose leaders who can govern themselves too. That's my point. Thank you.
I like that point. And I think that speaks very much to what Book One talked about in terms of raising people or inculcating virtue in people so that they can be either leaders or to be led. And yeah, you have to govern yourself or exercise self-control in order to choose a leader who's going to do the same thing. I like that. That's really good. So yeah, thank you for that very much. If it's all right, I would go to just this next reading. It's shorter, as I said, and then we'll come back. I guess after Faiwu, it was George and Darren, and then Mark, and then Phil maybe again. So let me just go do this next reading because it kind of continues on with the idea of finding balance in exercising reason. And this comes after, so this is 690D to 692A, and this comes after the discussion about these 6 potential claims to natural order in law giving. So they talked about, and I think maybe Darren mentioned this earlier, that they talked about, the idea that parents have claimed to lay down the laws for their children. Highborn people claim to be able to lay down laws for lowborn people. Elders claim to be able to lay down laws over youth, masters over slaves, stronger over weaker. So those are 5. And then the Athenian says, let's really focus on the 6, which is the wiser over the ignorant. And so the Athenian starts here. So you see, O legislator, as we might jocularly address someone who sets about legislation with undue optimism, you see how many titles to authority there are, and how they naturally conflict with each other. Now here's a source of civil strife we've discovered for you, which you must put to rights. First, though, join us in trying to find out how the kings of Argos and Messene went astray, and broke these rules, and so destroyed themselves and the power of Greece for all its splendor at that time. Wasn't it because they didn't appreciate the truth of Hesiod's remark that the half is often greater than the whole? He thought that when it is harmful to get the whole, and the half is enough, then enough is better than a feast, and is the preferable alternative. True enough, answers Clinias. So where do we suppose this destructive process invariably starts? Among kings or people? The Athenian asks. Clinias answers, most instances suggest that this is probably a disease of kings whose life of luxury has made them arrogant. The Athenian's response is, so it is clear that it was the kings of that era who were first infected by the acquisitive spirit in defiance of the law of the land. The precise point to which they had given their seal of approval by their word and oath became the ground of their disagreement, and this lack of harmony, which is, in our view, the crassest stupidity, though it looks like wisdom, put the whole arrangement jarringly off key and out of tune, hence its destruction. Quite likely, answers Clinias. Very well, the Athenian answers. Then what precautions ought a contemporary legislator to have taken in his code to nip this disease in the bud? God knows the answer is not difficult nowadays, and the point is quite simple to understand. Though if anyone had foreseen the problem then, assuming it was possible to do so, he'd have been wiser than we are. What do you mean? Asks Megillus. Hindsight, Megillus. In the perspective of today, it's easy to understand what should have been done then, and once understood, it's equally easy to explain. You'd better be even clearer than that, answers Megillus. The clearest way of putting it would be this, says the Athenian. What? Says Megillus. If you neglect the rule of proportion and fit excessively large sails to small ships, give too much food to a small body, or too high authority to a soul that doesn't measure up to it, the result is always disastrous. Body and soul become puffed up. Disease breaks out in the one, and in the other, arrogance quickly leads to injustice. Now, what are we getting at? Simply this. The mortal soul simply does not exist, my friends, which by dint of its natural qualities will ever make a success of supreme authority among men while it is still young and responsible to no one. Full of folly, the worst of diseases, it inevitably has its judgment corrupted and incurs the enmity of its closest friends. And once that happens, its total ruin and the loss of all power soon follow. A first-class lawgiver's job is to have a sense of proportion and to guard against the danger. Nowadays, it is a reasonable guess that this was in fact done at that time. However, it looks as if there was, well, Megillus breaks in what? The Athenian continues, some god who was concerned on your behalf and saw what was going to happen. He took your single line of kings and split it in 2, so as to restrict its powers to more reasonable proportions. After that, a man who combined human nature with some of the powers of a god observed that your leadership was still in a feverish state, so he blended the obstinacy and vigor of the Spartans with the prudent influence of age by giving the 28 elders the same authority in making important decisions as the kings. Your third savior saw that your government was still fretting and fuming with restless energy, so he put a kind of bridle on it in the shape of the power of the ephors. And the ephors, by the way, were people in Sparta who could actually control the king, a power which came very close to being held by lot. This is the formula that turned your kingship into a mixture of the right elements, so that thanks to its own stability, it ensured the stability of the rest of the state. So a little history there on Sparta, and talk about this sense of balance and proportion, maybe thinking about ledgers again, as Phil was talking about, that the leaders need to have this sense of balance and proportion, but the people need to have it as well. And reason is the basis of this. So I wanted to just do that reading so we can continue with the speakers list. I think I had Darren next, and then we'll go to Mark and then George. So we'll start with Darren.
I think I'm after. Is that what it is? Because I thought I was before, but okay.
Oh, okay, yeah, George. Sorry, I didn't know if you had your hand up still from the previous. Yeah, so we'll go to. I just want to make sure everybody has a chance to speak. So George, Darren, and then Mark.
Well, I want to firstly. I mean, I think when you say that there are some animals that are solitary, I mean that's my entire point. That humans are, by design, right, social animals, and in that sociability, morality is then also defined and dictated, right? And so there's that point. The other point that I would make is that think about how, and again, this is really very relevant for Plato, very germane. How are leaders chosen, right? I mean, Donald Trump, he's just born into wealth. Someone develops a better mousetrap, all of a sudden have $3 billion or $100 billion, and now they're politically dominant. So Plato would say exactly that. The fundamental problem of our society is precisely that there is no cultivation for leadership. And even worse than that, these leaders undermine our own cultivation to be followed, right? Because what does someone like Donald Trump do? They spew hate, right? They spew ignorance. They spew toxicity. That is an explicit effort to prevent us from being proper followers. So in this way, Plato has a great deal of insight in terms of the dysfunction and the rate at which we are destroying the basis for civilization. I mean, what's interesting, what I would say is that what we have today, in Plato's time, a civilization could be destroyed by some natural phenomenon, but the ecology was still basically the same. So you could build up another civilization. What we're doing is we're ending the civilization to end all civilizations. And again, Plato would point to the fact that we do not properly cultivate leaders, and that conversely, leaders are actively trying to prevent us from being good followers, if you will, or allowing us to be led properly. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that is really the point of book one. And I think you really hit on that leaders need to be cultivated as much as ordinary people, and virtue is the basis of all of that. So thank you. So yeah, we'll go to Darren and then Mark, and then I don't know if Faiwu had another point to make, but we'll do you after Faiwu if that's all right. So Darren.
So I haven't read beyond book 3, so I don't know if more institutional recommendations are coming. I suspect there are, but this section here about Sparta and how it dealt well with the forces that exist within society, which in part through the division of powers, essentially. So in the section you just finished reading, is really modern. Like there's very modern understandings here about about how to make a polity work well. So you don't have, and I think it comes up later. I don't think we read this section yet, but against maybe many common preconceptions or maybe misconceptions of Plato from people who maybe have only read like 1 or 2 books of the Republic, he comes out squarely against strong authoritarianism here. He says a good society needs to blend wisdom, sure, but also freedom, and that will lead to harmony and friendship. So it needs sort of both those moments. So he's going to talk about, I think we might be reading this section later, but he talks about both democracy and monarchy and how a good system has to blend both those impulses. It just can't be all about, the authoritarian monarchy saying do this, do that. It also needs room for that freedom. And I just really want to tie this back in with our discussion in book 2, and actually book 1 and 2, because those 2 books were sort of unexpectedly for me about partying and drinking, which I totally did not expect Opening the Laws to be reading about why we need to party and drink more. Okay. So I appreciated, how Plato's often unexpected in these ways, surprising in these ways. So, but this is like the logic here is actually exactly the same. So whereas book 3, we're moving into political institutions now, and the need for this kind of balance between the free and the rational impulses, we saw precisely the same thing, right? If we recall in book 2 about the need for drinking, and in fact for wine and drinking as the guardian, or what was the term? The guardian of the safeguard of proper moral education is drinking. Okay, remember that.
Or the test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also because actually I would like to come back to this because I don't think we actually really talked we didn't return back to this issue of drinking in the last meeting, which I think is quite significant. So he talks about how the procedure, the institution is that young people aren't allowed to drink, and as you get older, you're allowed more and more drink. and participation in these like Dionysian like choruses and parties. And even the interlocutors found this to be like a surprising and interesting point. But I think we should focus less on the drinking per se, though, right? Like that's sort of like a peculiar thing. But like the essential point is that just like the state here needs this kind of balance between these opposing forces, that an individual needs it too. So the danger I just want to read this. I was just looking back at the book 2 here. So I just want to read a bit of and I think it's relevant to what we see in the politics, in the more political institutions of book 3. So he says that drink was the God gave to mankind to help cure the crabbiness of age. This is the gift he gave us to make us young again. We forget our peevishness and our hard cast of mind, and our hard cast of mind becomes softer and grows more malleable, just like iron thrust in the fire. And this is why, like, he says old people, I think the specifically 50 and above, need to drink a lot. This is actually part of the institution, and young people shouldn't. And so from this, I think the important point is that, again, not the drinking per se, but like the picture that Plato is presenting us of what ethical being is like. So it's not just like pure reason. And so this is the critique of a lot of people seem to have of Plato, including of like Nietzsche famously attacked Socrates for being overly rational. But we saw this is absolutely not the case. That's like a false conception of Plato we should clarify here. So that Plato recommends, yes, we need to have reason, but it also has to be animated by this kind of liveliness that wine will provide the old people who become like too like cold and peevish, and he says hard cast of mind here, and crabby. So yeah, so basically we need a balance between this rational side and also the sort of vitality and the feeling part of the human being and the animated part. And just sorry, one last point here. I think in book 2 we saw that young people needed we needed music again, and I think it was quite interesting how music comes in book 3 too. But back in book 2, part of the education of young people was with music and dance. That's what an educated person looks like. He knows how to, he dances and enjoys music. But for the purpose of this is part of education because it gets the young people to like the good. It's not just to like the music per se, it's actually to love and like the good. So for old people, then we need drink because one of the reasons was it helps them like dance and stuff. It makes them dance. So it sort of reawakens their love for the good. So the good is not just reason per se. Remember, that's what those are the sophists who only like do reason. The philosopher has both reason and also this animated love part. So it's the love of wisdom that makes a philosopher, and the wine will help the people do that. So yeah. So anyway, that I think it's interesting that there's this analogy between book 2 and book 3. Book 2 is about the individual and the right balance in the individual, but it maps onto the balance we see being described in the political realm between the monarchical and the democratic impulses. So I think that's the almost exact analogy is quite interesting.
Yeah, interesting point. Yeah, that balance between love and wisdom philosophy. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. We are running out of time, and we have literally 3 minutes left in the scheduled times. I'm hoping that we might be able to go another 10 or 15 minutes, if that's all right with folks, because I want to, I won't have a chance to read this next bit, but I do want to read the parts at the end, even if we don't get to discuss them. I will just take a very quick moment here. The next reading that I had, I won't have time to read it all, but I just want to make this point because it again talks about cultivating leaders. And this is the part that I selected in the reading from 693C to 694D. And this is a bit of the history of the Persian Empire. And it starts by talking how Cyrus was the great Persian leader who built the empire and was a brilliant military commander and was good to the people and all of that. And then Cyrus dies and his son Cambyses takes over. And Cambyses was a complete idiot, destroyed things, was practically insane. And then Cambyses lasted, I think, for 7 or 8 years. And then Darius took over. And Darius was better than Cambyses. So it's interesting, like this point about stability in leadership is very important. And that was the purpose of this history. And I just wanted to say I'll just read this a little bit. The Athenian says, so how are we to explain the disaster under Cambyses and the virtually complete recovery under Darius? To help our reconstruction events, shall we have a shot at some inspired guessing? Clinias says, yes, because this topic we've embarked on will certainly help our inquiry. The Athenian says, my guess then about Cyrus is that he was doubtless a good commander and a loyal patriot. He never considered, even superficially, the problem of correct education. And as for running a household, I'd say he never paid any attention to it at all. Clinias says, and what interpretation are we to put on a remark like that? The Athenian answers, I mean that he probably spent his entire life after infancy on campaign and handed over his children to the women to bring up. These women reared them from their earliest years as though they were already heaven's special favorites and darlings, endowed with all the blessings that implies. They wouldn't allow anyone to thwart their beatitudes in anything, and they force everybody to rhapsodize about what the children said or did. You can imagine the sort of person they produced. And I have here this little picture I couldn't resist of a child sticking out her tongue wearing a crown. Spoiled brats. So anyway, I just wanted to read that little bit. So we'll go to Mark and then Phil and then Faiwu if you have a point. Yeah, Mark.
Thanks, James.
Yeah.
I just wanted to underline the idea of the harmony here, which is carried over from 689, where we have discord, diaphonos, and that's 689a and 689d, where he says without concord, that's symphonos, there can be no phronesis or intelligence of any kind. And then with 689, 691, he talks about something which is not symphonate, so not harmonious. And then he introduces the metrion, this measure. And he says, without it, we have hubris and a complete injustice. And this is the greatest disorder. So he talks about it in medical terms. And one of the things, Darren, that you just said in your very wide-ranging comments was that if one thing happens, another thing happens, then we will have harmony. But I think one way to think about it, a different way to think about it, is that the harmony is a necessary condition. So without the harmony, no justice can come about, no happiness, and this is how basic the due measure is. I forget what it's called in your translation at 691c, where the Athenian begins that longer speech there, if one neglects the due measure.
Right.
And that's the metrion.
If you neglect the rule of proportion and fit excessively large sails to small ships or give too much food to the small body or too high authority to a soul that doesn't measure up to it, the result is always disastrous.
Right. And so if you think about that as a conditional, if you don't observe the due measure, then it leads to destruction. Then the other conditional it would correspond to is, if you want to be saved, then you have to have the measure. And that means that the measure is a necessary condition for being saved.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, it is about being able to measure. It's being able to measure in this realm of becoming where our senses do not deliver complete measurements to us. And so we need reason to exercise that ability to measure. And I found it really interesting in that part that I read when he talked twice about dividing things in half. He talked about dividing the ruling class in half, and having half sometimes is better than a whole. I think there's a little bit of Platonic math in there, in the sense that half is the only fraction that, when added to itself, equals one. And that makes it a pretty powerful fraction. So I think he's appealing to some restraint of desire there. We might desire for the whole thing, or as he said in the earlier part that I read, we might pray for the whole thing. But maybe we should consider praying for maybe half and accepting half, and maybe that's not so bad. So thank you for that. In the time remaining, we have Phil, and then we'll go to Faiwu.
I would just add to that, James, I would just add to that the one point that it is in the passage that we just looked at where he says that reason, intelligence, and opinion has to be coupled with love and the desire that accompanied them.
Mm.
So that's how the desire is getting narrowed down.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll go to Phil.
Yeah, I think there has to be a relationship between, I was to say, one's, well, the problem really is the relationship between the finite and infinite. And since human beings are finite, how does the infinite, or I guess the upper reaches of the pure spirit takes place? It seems to me, this is really an issue that's talked about between the ruler, or I guess the philosopher king, who has wisdom. And wisdom is not, absolute knowledge, but sort of relative knowledge, but with aspiration for looking toward the divine, in a sense. But because it's not infinite, you need the advisory board, in a sense. And they're the one that, in a sense, exercise a kind of judgment. I'm not sure to what degree it should be tied to the public. So I'm not I find it interesting that he should start with the drinking party, but I guess that's how you get connected to the public in general. My first thought was that was the relationship between the, in the German army, between the supreme command and the field officers who are seeing the things on the ground. And they make judgment on a tactical means of, like, what is happening now? What should we do? And the problem with the German high command in World War I was, they just didn't believe the judgment that's coming above about what's happening on the ground, because they knew they were right, but they weren't. And they needed a feedback loop. But I think of it now in a better way, and it really, in a sense, somewhat reflects the American system in a way, if it was done in the right way. I'm not saying it's done in the right way. The presidency is supposed to be wise, and it's like, in some sense, looking toward aspirations of getting wiser. And he got this advisors. You could maybe start with a cabinet, but I really think that the greater bureaucracy itself. The bureaucracy holds the laws and makes a judgment on how to distribute the laws in a way that is somewhat connected to the populace in general. So in that sense, they just make judgments. And I guess if you're a good enough person in the bureaucracy, you eventually gain more and more wisdom, and you move up the ladder in a way. So I think there needs to be these two. Otherwise, It's just a singular man up there or women up there. They are wise, but they still don't know what the hell they're doing. So they need some advisors, and you need some laws, and you need some on the ground judgment about does this guy need help or does that guy need help? And the law's got to be distributed in a way that it is the law, but on the other hand, the distribution, you got to make a judgment on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's important. And so in some ways, it does reflect a democratic system, but done in the right way. Right now, it's not done in the right way because all of them are bought off. And so we don't have the right purpose. But if it's done in the right way, then I think you have a fairly decent relationship between wisdom and what's on the ground that's needed. That's it, Phil.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting comment about the distribution, because that's actually was in the next reading that I'm not going to have time to do. But what you did point out was, I could just read this little paragraph here, which was 693C or thereabouts, 693C to D, where the Athenian says there are two mother constitutions, so to speak, which you could fairly say have given birth to all the others. Monarchy is a proper name for the first, and democracy for the second. The former has been taken to extreme length by the Persians, and the latter by my country. Virtually all the others, as I said, are varieties of these two. It is absolutely vital for a political system to combine them if, and this is of course the point of our advice when we insist that no state formed without these two elements can be constituted properly, if it is to enjoy freedom and friendship applied with good judgment. So I kind of like that tie into what you were just saying. And when you talk about the advisory board, we'll see where it's in book 5, I think, where they start to set up the offices of the state, which includes the guardians of the laws. So no king is above that. So that's great. So let me go to Darren and then Faiwu, and then maybe if there's just a minute or two at the end, I'll just read that last bit about harmony and music. So Darren.
Oh, maybe because I did want to comment on the music and stuff, so maybe it's related to what you're gonna say. So maybe can I comment after, because it might be related. Yeah, maybe that'll be better. Yeah,
if we get a minute,
it was
okay.
actually literally related to that. So
okay, all right,
yeah.
Okay, and then so we'll go to Faiwu then.
I'd like to address on cultivating leaders. I don't think most people have any idea what being a good leader entails, because most people don't. I mean, a lot of people aren't even a good leader or successful leader of their family or a business or a community. How do they know what a good leader requires? That's why so many people have these misconceptions, all kinds of perceptions about Donald Trump. Because most people are not qualified to choose a leader. Therefore, absolute democracy with complete liberal values in current Western nations might not be the best way forward. I agree with the last paragraph you read. We need a combination of both monarchy and democracy, because the human nature is arrogant and ignorant. So we need checks and balances. But we also need leaders. Only leaders are qualified to cultivate other leaders because they got the expertise, experience, etc., knowledge. Therefore, it's not wise to give everyone voting rights. Before the suffrage movements, I think since the suffrage movements, the British Empire declined because more and more common people who are not qualified to choose leaders are given rights to choose leaders, and That's
Mhm.
actually a disaster.
Mm.
So probably a authoritative government with certain democratic values is the best system forward.
Mm.
That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And we'll see actually, and this goes back to what they were saying earlier in the second part, I think that I read about young people not having had a sense of responsibility. And so they're not really able to lead until they have a little bit of life experience and can do that. And we'll see when they start setting up the more detailed structure of this colony that they're going to create, where age comes into play so that not everybody has the power to select the leaders, that you have to have some responsibility and some ability to exercise reason before you're given that power, because then that affects everybody else. So, yeah, we'll definitely see that, the checks and balances and people understanding what it is to be a good leader. I mean, that's not just about getting 50% plus one of the votes. It's about actually doing good things and exercising reason, which is in short supply sometimes these days. So thank you for that. Let me just go to this last reading here. I just wanted to read this because I mentioned in the opening, and this is this bit about music from 700A to 701B. The Athenian starts, when the old laws applied, my friends, the people were not in control. On the contrary, they lived in a kind of voluntary slavery to the laws. Agilles says, which laws have you in mind? The Athenian responds, I'm thinking particularly of the regulations about the music of that period, music being the proper place to start a description of how life became progressively freer of controls. In those days, Athenian music comprised various categories and forms. One type of song consisted of prayers to the gods, which were termed hymns, and there was another quite different type, which you might well have called laments. Paeans made up a third category, and there was also a fourth called a dithyramb, whose name was, I think, the birth of Dionysus. There existed another kind of song, too, which they thought of as a separate class, and the name they gave it was this very word that is so often on our lips, nomus, for the lyre, as they always added. Once these categories and a number of others had been fixed, no one was allowed to pervert them by using one sort of tune in a composition belonging to another category. And what was the authority which had to know these standards and use its knowledge in reaching its verdicts and crack down on the disobedient? Well, certainly no notice was taken of the catcalls and uncouth calling of the audience, as it is nowadays, nor yet the applause that indicates approval. People of taste and education made it a rule to listen to the performance with silent attention right through to the end. Children and their attendants and the general public could always be disciplined and controlled by a stick. Such was the rigor with which the mass of the people was prepared to be controlled in the theater and to refrain from passing judgment by shouting. Later, as time went on, composers arose who started to set a fashion of breaking the rules and offending good taste. They did have a natural artistic talent, but they were ignorant of the correct and legitimate standards laid down by the muse. Gripped by a frenzied and excessive lust for pleasure, they jumbled together laments and hymns, mixing paeans and dithyrambs, and even imitated pipe tunes on the lyre. The result was a total confusion of styles. Unintentionally, in their idiotic way, they misrepresented their art, claiming that in music there are no standards of right and wrong at all, but that the most correct criterion is the pleasure of a man who enjoys the performance, whether he is a good man or not. On these principles they based their compositions, and they accompanied them with propaganda to the same effect. Consequently, they gave the ordinary man not only a taste for breaking the laws of music, but the arrogance to set himself up as a capable judge. The audiences, once silent, began to use their tongues. They claimed to know what was good and bad in music, and instead of a musical meritocracy, a sort of vicious theatocracy arose. But if this democracy had been limited to gentlemen and had applied only to music, no great harm would have been done. In the event, however, music proved to be the starting point of everyone's conviction that he was an authority on everything and of a general disregard for the law. Complete license was not far behind. The conviction that they knew made them unafraid, and assurance engendered effrontery. You see, a reckless lack of respect for one's betters is effrontery of particular viciousness, which springs from a freedom from inhibitions that has gone much too far. I just wanted to end with that part because I found it was really interesting. I mean, music, I think, is a metaphor for harmony and the idea of playing to the audience. And do you play good music or do you play what the audience thinks is good music? And so here, to go back to my introduction, I think there's a sense here that there is a good music and there's a bad music. And we should at least know what the good music consists of, and therefore harmony, which is important, harmony in the community. So I think he's using it a bit as a metaphor here. And he talks specifically about pleasure. The most correct criterion is a pleasure of a man who enjoyed the performance. That's what the audience comes to think. But are we equipped to measure? And this goes back to the question of, is man the measure of all things, which was the subject of the Theaetetus. And so are we truly equipped to understand what good music is if we don't understand the very basis of music and the harmony of the notes, the symphony that Mark was talking about earlier? So I wanted to end with that reading. And I don't know, Darren, if you had just a brief comment to make on that.
Yeah, I did want to comment on music, so I'm glad to have the opportunity. I'll try to make this quick. I don't think it'll be that long. So I initially though, I put my hand up because I wanted to respond to what Mark said about harmony and how important that is in order to make other things possible, or at least it's an important aspect of the whole, because it seems like the way the ideal society, at least at this point so far, has been described is that it has wisdom, but it is free and has harmony. So it's like a tripartite thing. I'm not quite clear like how harmony maybe comes before those things. Maybe it'll be more clear later. But the thing I wanted to comment on was how, regarding harmony, so here in book 3, we're talking about the political level, but we saw harmony of the soul in books 1 and 2. It's dawning on me that's basically what books 1 and 2 are about, not about drinking and partying per se, which, as you said, James, might just be a metaphor. We might have other devices we might want to think of today in our modern age. But what struck me is that disbalancing and disharmony in both cases are related to design of the institutions, like political institutions, or at the individual level, and in our educational institutions and the kinds of education we give people. And so in the section you just read, just tie this back with music, I think it could be curious to someone in this day and age with all the kinds of music we have now, including like rock and hip hop and all the stuff, why like the music is taken so seriously here, like the forms can never change. And I think like, again, like music, as he said, maybe it's just a symbol or metaphor. At least we can take it that way because, we have so many other things in our world these days. I mean, even classical music has gone through a lot of like interesting changes. I don't think we would deny like Beethoven's innovations as being corrupt or somehow, because of how much his music gives to and offers us in terms of our understanding of humanity. Even though Beethoven was innovative, from Bach and Mozart on. But the reason why music is taken so seriously is that, at least at this time, and as Plato imagines it, it was for, as we saw in book 2, it was basically to educate. It was the device for educating young people into virtue. So it has to be right. It can't have all these other forms, because this is the thing that Plato imagines. And I think we should. To me, what was interesting about book 2 was how, compared to so many other dialogues of Plato, like where educating in virtue is talked about in a very mysterious way, like how is it ever possible? It seems like people have tried to educate people into virtue and made so many attempts, but it often doesn't work. But here we actually get like a positive proposal, and it is with music, because music is something that touches the soul, and it is part of our first education. So yeah. So anyway, basically I just wanted to say that, responding to Mark, that like harmony and proportion is important, and how it's in these institutions being offered in this dialogue of the laws that seems to be helping us with that. And at the political level, of course, we saw it was the separation of powers, at least so far. That's what we've seen. And how under Cyrus, the Persians had authoritarianism, but they also had like, I don't know what if the translation's bad, but it literally says that Cyrus allowed free speech. Like that's literally the translation. So that sort of describes how it's possible for institutions to be both, to have both impulses, to have this harmony.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and that maybe goes back to a little bit of what Fai Wu was talking about in terms of this monarchy being tempered by democracy, being tempered by monarchy. And yeah, I like, actually, you pointed out that music was a device for educating youth in virtue. That's a very good point, actually. And that's something that we wouldn't necessarily understand from today's standards, but certainly I think back at that time it was critically important. A philosopher had to be trained in music, and I guess that was to understand the concept of harmony. So
Yeah, and it seems like the drinking for old people. I have to go back and look at the details, but I think that's ultimately related to music too, because it gets them moving and dancing, and it provides them a liveliness that Athenian says safeguards their education. In this case, it seems like their moral education. Yeah. So even the drinking is related to music.
Oh, that's great. Phil, did you want to make a brief comment before we end?
Yeah, I did say my hesitation about the drinking party. And I think I'll explain it when we were talking about the drinking party. Yeah, that's a good way to be connected to the people and exercise, their emotional content. But remember, what was stressed in that drinking party is a matter of proportions. In other words, guys, it's time to go home. You know what I mean? So that is the exercise of judgment in terms of controlling the excesses that could happen in the drinking party. So the drinking party brings them in, but it tells you when to have a proportion to leave. So that's an important part. That's done, by the way, not through wisdom, but through judgment. No, it's time to leave now.
I love that. Yeah, that's actually really good because that ties into that reading that I did on balance and proportion. And it's something that if it's not done correctly, the proportions get all out of control. And so maybe that's a really interesting connection to why the drinking party motif continued through book 2 a lot, and it continues into book 3 as well. So
just quickly, I think the drinking parties are supervised. I think that book 2 does describe them as being supervised.
And
exactly. And it's only for old people.
Well, and that's why the old people understand proportion. Some life experience is required for that. So yes, well, listen, thank you all for attending. I mean, we actually made our way, I think, through book 3 in quite good measure, I think. So that's great. So we'll turn to book 4 in 2 weeks. We'll return to our bi-weekly schedule. And I will end the recording now with thanks for everybody for attending. Hopefully everybody can come back in 2 weeks. Normally I would do a half hour of Plato's Cafe, but we've run over time. So I think we'll just end the recording at this point and we'll reconvene in 2 weeks. So thank you for attending and such a great discussion. I'm looking forward to listening to this recording.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.